The rain had not stopped for 9 days. It dripped from the torn canvas roofs, trickled down the muddy trench walls, and gathered in shallow, freezing puddles that swallowed boots as if the earth itself wanted to claim every step the soldiers took. Northern France, late autumn of 1944, felt less like a battlefield and more like a sodden wasteland where sound traveled strangely, muffled one moment, sharp the next. In the early dawn, when the fog was thick enough to blur even the closest silhouettes, the front line resembled a ghost corridor stretching between farms that had already collapsed into heaps of broken beams and blackened stone. Somewhere in that bleakness stood Corporal Elias Mercer, motionless for a long moment as he listened to the hiss of a battered field radio. Elias looked like any other exhausted soldier, covered in mud to the point where his uniform's original color was a matter of speculation. But beneath that anonymity lived a mind that never stopped observing details others ignored. He was a quiet man, almost invisible in the daily rhythm of military routine, but his thoughts moved in restless patterns. Each crackle of the radio seemed to carry a memory he didn't want, yet could never escape. Whenever the static intensified abruptly, his mind flashed to a night years earlier. The fire, the smoke spreading too fast, the terrified screams of his younger brother trapped behind the collapsed beam. Elias had been only 12, yet old enough to believe he should have found a way to save him. That guilt stayed with him like a second heartbeat. In the dim light of the communications dugout, Elias sat hunched over his equipment, soldering iron in one hand, a half-burned cigarette in the other, tools scattered around like artifacts of a private ritual. He was supposed to be performing routine maintenance, checking frequencies, confirming that HQ channels were unblocked. Instead, he was secretly testing a crude attachment he had built from discarded wires, cracked vacuum tubes, and a broken antenna segment he had found behind the supply tent. It was fragile, ugly, and not officially approved, which meant the officers would have dismissed it immediately. But to Elias, it was a lifeline, a device capable of revealing something no one else seemed to notice. For weeks, he had sensed subtle patterns in electromagnetic noise. Most operators treated static as an annoyance, a natural byproduct of storms or distant transmissions. But Elias listened closely. He heard faint fluctuations that repeated with uncanny precision minutes before enemy shelling or armored movement. He realized those fluctuations were echoes, not messages, not intentional signals, but distortions generated by the engines of German vehicles pushing through the soaked countryside. The thought had terrified him at first, not because of what it meant for war, but because it reminded him of the helplessness he had felt the night of the fire, the sense that disaster was approaching, but no one else recognized it. Command meetings were happening just a few meters above his head, officers arguing over maps ruined by moisture, debating defensive lines as if the enemy moved predictably, logically, orderly. Elias knew reality was far different. Enemy tanks prowled the mist like metal beasts, appearing and disappearing, sometimes repositioning so silently that even scouts failed to track them. Yet the radio static always knew. Elias had tried once to mention his theory to a lieutenant, phrasing it carefully to sound technical rather than speculative. The lieutenant barely looked up from his clipboard before dismissing him with a vague remark about imagined patterns brought on by fatigue. After that, Elias spoke no more about it. He only listened, watched, and built. The morning shifted into a dull, metallic gray. Soldiers trudged through the trenches, their breaths visible in the cold air. Elias stepped outside for a moment, stretching his stiff back, scanning the fog-covered horizon. His unit was spread thin across a weak point in the Allied defensive arc, a segment command considered low risk. But Elias felt an unease in the pit of his stomach. Something was wrong in the air, in the static, in the faint repetition he had begun hearing before dawn. It was subtle, buried beneath layers of interference, but it pulsed like a hidden heartbeat. As he returned to the dugout, he glanced again at the device he had pieced together. It was mounted on a wooden crate, wires trailing like veins. The solder joints were sloppy, the dial half-functional, but when he gently rotated it, the noise shifted in a way conventional radios never produced. He inhaled sharply. There was again the strange oscillation, the one that always preceded armored movement. A tremor of fear threaded through him. If the pattern was identical to the previous events, then something larger, more coordinated, was unfolding behind the fog. The sound triggered another memory. He saw the fire again, but not the flames. He saw himself running in circles, calling for help while everyone else insisted it was under control. They had been wrong then. 2. By the time the blaze intensified, it was too late. His brother's face, illuminated by the burning doorway, still haunted him. And in this war, with its endless storms and collapsing structures, Elias felt that same pressure every time his warnings were ignored. He crouched closer to the device, adjusting the dial with fingertips that trembled from cold and tension. The pulse sharpened. Not good. Not good at all. He could already imagine what the officers would say if he brought this up. Uncertainty equals risk. Risk equals delay. Delay equals unnecessary movement. Protocol would not allow action based on unverified noise. But the noise wasn't lying. A distant rumble reached the trench. Faint, indecisive, strangely rhythmic. It could have been thunder, except thunder did not come in steady intervals. Elias swallowed hard. The storm approaching was not from the sky, and he was the only one who knew it. The rumble grew heavier as the morning thickened into a suffocating curtain of fog. It didn't come fast or loud enough to alarm the officers yet. It crept, slow and deliberate, like a predator testing its weight before pouncing. Elias stood in the narrow trench with water up to his ankles, feeling the vibration in the mud before most men even noticed it in the air. Around him, soldiers moved sleepily, adjusting belts, wiping condensation from rifle stocks, trading murmured complaints about breakfast rations and the cold. No one lifted their head at the subtle tremor passing beneath their feet. But Elias did. He pressed one hand against the trench wall, feeling the faint shudder run through the soaked earth. His breath condensed in front of him, dissolving into fog like the last coherent thought before panic sets in. The frequency pulses inside his improvised device had sharpened into a distinct pattern, an approaching series of harmonics he had begun to catalog mentally over the last month. He recognized this one. It wasn't just armor. It was coordinated armor. Inside the dugout, he fumbled to connect the power supply again, wiping rainwater from the metal contacts. As soon as the module warmed, the oscillation returned, clearer than before, a steady mechanical heartbeat. A Panzer column wasn't just moving. It was aligning, tightening its formation, advancing with intentional rhythm only a trained operator would sense in the radio noise. Elias felt a spike of adrenaline, the same cold surge he felt as a child when a house roof crackled under growing flames and no adult believed him. He grabbed his standard headset and switched to the official frequency. Predictably, it was cluttered with routine chatter. Quartermasters asking for supply transfers, officers reviewing night patrol notes, static from distant units. No emergency signals, no warnings, nothing that reflected the terror building in the fog. A sergeant passed by the dugout entrance, glancing inside. "Mercer," he grunted. "HQ on status reports on all comm lines within the hour. They're planning another eastward push." His tone carried no urgency. He didn't know. None of them did. Elias swallowed his frustration and nodded, though his pulse hammered so loudly he barely heard the rest of the sergeant's words. Another push? They were preparing for an offensive at the exact moment a German armored spear was preparing to cut through the weakest sector of the division. The miscalculation was catastrophic and preventable, if someone listened. He hesitated only a moment before stepping out into the trench to find Lieutenant Harrigan, the nearest officer with operational authority. Harrigan stood with two corporals around a map case laid across a crate, discussing supply runs and winter gear distribution. Elias approached, clearing his throat. "Sir," he said, trying to keep the tremor from his voice, "I believe there's significant armored movement north of our line." The static. Harrigan didn't look up. "Not now, Mercer. We're preparing for her." "It's not normal static, sir," Elias pressed, surprising even himself with the edge in his tone. "The pattern is consistent with engines moving in coordinated spacing. I've tracked this before." The lieutenant finally lifted his eyes, annoyed. "Engines? Based on what? That scrap heap you solder together every night?" "Mercer, the division has scouts, aircraft, recon units. If armor were closing in, we'd know." Elias felt heat rise behind his eyes. The fog around them seemed to press closer. "Sir, with respect, we don't know. Our lines of communication have been unstable for weeks, and German intercept teams. Harrigan raised a hand sharply. Enough. You're a radio operator, not intelligence. Get back to your station. The words hit with the same helpless weight as that night long ago, when Elias shouted warnings about the spreading fire, and the adults told him he was imagining things. He stood there frozen as the lieutenant and corporals returned to their map. The conversation was already over for them, but the rumble in the ground was growing. He retreated to the communications post, rain dripping from the brim of his helmet. As soon as he entered, he bent over the makeshift module again. The waveform fluttered, then steadied into an intense pulse, much stronger than an hour earlier. His stomach twisted. The column wasn't just approaching. It was turning directly toward the unfortified segment south of the trench line, the area command had designated as low threat. If they broke through there, the entire flank would fold. His hands moved before his thoughts caught up. He adjusted the dial, tried to isolate directional cues. It wasn't a perfect system. The equipment was too crude. Yet the signal layered itself like a distant drumline. He could almost sense the angle of approach. The tanks were fanning out, preparing to breach. A distant shell cracked through the fog. Then another. The ground shook hard enough to send a cascade of mud from the trench wall. Shouts erupted from down the line. At first confused, then panicked, Elias sprinted outside. The horizon was a muted smear of gray, but faint flashes of muzzle bursts flickered beyond the tree line, like lightning trapped behind a curtain. A barrage of German artillery slammed into the secondary trenches, sending fountains of mud and debris skyward. Soldiers scrambled for positions. Officers shouted conflicting orders. Radios crackled with fragmented reports of breaches, retreating squads, disappearing flares. Elias stared into the fog, listening. Beneath the explosions, beneath the rain and shouting, the pulsing frequency of engines grew clearer, stronger. They were close, frighteningly close, and no one understood how blind they truly were. He looked back at the dugout where his module still hummed. The weight of responsibility pressed onto his shoulders like wet sand. He had knowledge that could change the next 10 minutes, maybe save lives, maybe save the entire division. But to use it, he would have to break protocol. Again, across the trench, an abandoned artillery battery sat half-sunk in mud, unused for days due to lack of targeting intelligence. Useless, unless someone could guide it manually. His heart pounded. A thought formed, reckless and urgent. If command refused to act, then the decision fell to him alone. Elias Mercer, a quiet corporal buried in the mud of northern France, stepped into the open trench line with a clarity he had not felt since the night of the fire. This time, he would not stand still while disaster consumed everyone around him. This time, he would act. The trench shuddered again as another shell exploded somewhere behind the fog curtain, spraying chunks of wet clay into the air. Elias didn't flinch this time. His world had narrowed into a single, unwavering idea. He had to reposition the abandoned artillery battery before the German armor reached the ridge. If they seized that ground, the entire division would be cut in half. No retreat, no supply lines, no chance to reorganize. The officers hadn't realized it yet, but the battle was already tipping into disaster. He tightened his helmet strap and slung the improvised module across his chest, securing it with a strip of canvas torn from an ammo pouch. The device clacked softly against his ribs as he moved, its tubes glowing faintly beneath the rain-damp cloth he had wrapped around it. He hesitated only long enough to check the pulse again. The oscillation was rising, sharp, stacked harmonics, like the growl of an animal picking up speed. The tanks were closing in. Elias stepped into the open trench, weaving through soldiers rushing the opposite direction. Some carried wounded men. Others hauled ammunition crates. Most simply ran because someone behind them had shouted that the flanking line was collapsing. He caught fragments of their conversations, panic, uncertainty, disbelief. None of them understood how close the threat truly was. None of them could hear what he heard. As he neared the trench exit, a sergeant spotted him. "Mercer, where the hell are you going? Get back to comms. HQ is calling for status updates." Elias didn't stop. "They won't matter, Sergeant. The line's about to break." The sergeant blinked, startled by the certainty in his voice. But Elias was already moving past him, boots sinking deep into the mud. Rainwater splashed against his legs as he climbed out of the trench and onto the uneven, crater field above him. The sky looked like a smeared watercolor of gray and smoke. Visibility was barely 30 meters. Perfect for armor. Fatal for infantry. He crouched low and advanced toward the abandoned battery. A trio of 105mm howitzers half buried in the muck, their barrels tilted uselessly toward the wrong sector. They hadn't been fired since last week's failed counteroffensive. The crews were gone, reassigned to reinforce other lines. Now the guns sat forgotten, swallowed by mud and bureaucracy. Elias reached the first howitzer and ran his hand along the cold metal. The frame vibrated faintly with distant impacts as the battlefield itself pulsed through it. He dropped to his knees and checked the angle screws. Stiff but workable. The gun could pivot, slowly but enough. He moved to the elevation controls. Also functional. A spark of hope flickered inside him, small but steady. He wiped the rain from his eyes and pulled the improvised module from his chest. Kneeling beside the gun, he set the device on a wooden crate and shielded it from the rain with his helmet. The pulse now trembled like a warning siren beneath the static. Elias rotated the dial, isolating the low-frequency rumble. The tanks were moving through a narrow corridor, a shallow depression running behind the tree line to the northwest. On the official maps, it wasn't marked as a viable approach route, which meant Command believed it too muddy for armor. Command was wrong. He pictured the landscape from memory, a natural funnel leading toward the ridge, concealed by the fog, shielded from most of the Allied defenses. If the Germans reached that funnel, they'd strike the heart of the division like a hammer. Elias clenched his jaw. "Not today," he muttered. He braced his shoulder against the howitzer and pushed, straining as a heavy steel groaned. Mud sucked greedily at his boots, threatening to pull him down, but he kept leaning, inch by inch, forcing the barrel to turn toward the hidden corridor. His arms burned. His breath came in gasps. Behind him, another shell detonated, spraying dirt across his back. He didn't stop. After several agonizing minutes, the barrel aligned roughly with the direction indicated by the radio pulse. His heart pounded with a mix of fear and exhilaration. He knew this wasn't perfect artillery science. He didn't have range calculations, forward observers, or clearance from command. He had only instinct, improvisation, and a device the officers laughed at. But sometimes the difference between chaos and survival was one person who refused to accept the expected. He sprinted to the ammunition racks. By some miracle, a few shells remained, 3, maybe 4, enough for a chance, though not enough for mistakes. He loaded the first round with trembling hands, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing into his palms. As he worked, memories returned again. His brother's pale face illuminated by firelight, the scream he hadn't been fast enough to answer, the guilt that shaped every quiet hour since. He remembered the sensation of standing frozen in the doorway, knowing what had to be done but fearing he'd fail. That night, he had hesitated. Today, he would not. He pulled the firing lanyard. The howitzer roared, kicking back violently, sending a shockwave through Elias's chest. The shell disappeared into the fog, leaving a sulphurous residue in the air. Elias pressed the headphones to his ears, holding his breath. For a moment, there was only static. Then, a deep metallic thud, followed by shouting, engines shifting, turret servos whining in confusion. A hit, not a direct one, but close enough to disrupt the formation. Elias felt a surge of fierce, breathless triumph. He reloaded as fast as his shaking arms allowed. The next round slid into the chamber with a harsh scrape. He adjusted the elevation, fine-tuning based on the pulse vibration. The tanks were scattering, trying to reposition. Good. Confusion was his ally. He fired again. The shot boomed through the fog, louder than the first. Elias didn't wait for the result. He was already reaching for the third shell when yelling broke out behind him. "Mercer, what in God's name are you doing?" 2 officers and a squad of soldiers were rushing toward him through the mud. Harrigan's voice cut through the chaos. "Cease fire. You don't have clearance. Stop immediately. Elias's hands froze over the shell. The officers were close, seconds away. If they stopped him now, the corridor would open for the tanks. The battle would collapse. Men would die, all because rules mattered more than reality. He looked down at the module. The pulse spiked, 3 beats, sharp and fast. The tanks were entering the corridor. He had 1 shot left, and no permission to take it. Elias gripped the shell, heart hammering, mud dripping from his sleeves, officers shouting as they lunged toward him. He made his choice. Elias jammed the final shell into the howitzer's breech as Harrigan and the squad closed in, boots splashing through the muck, rifles pointed downward but ready. Rain hammered against the metal frame, rolling off in thick drops that streaked down the barrel. Elias barely heard the angry shouts anymore. His ears were filled with the rising static of the enemy's proximity, the urgent tremor pulsing through his device like a heartbeat pushed to its limit. "Mercer, stand down." Harrigan's voice cracked with fury and fear. "You fire that gun again, and I will have you court-martialed, do you hear me?" But Elias had already stopped listening. His focus had narrowed into a tunnel. The world shrank to the gun, the dial, the rising oscillation, and the knowledge that the tanks were seconds away from reaching the funnel. He pressed his palm to the vibrating metal of the howitzer, feeling the resonance through the cold steel. His breath fogged the air in front of him as he whispered under it, "Come on, come on." He leaned toward the module one last time, shielding it from the rain with his arm. The signal was wild now, chaotic, overlapping, filled with interference bursts from multiple engines converging. That meant they had committed fully. No hesitation. No scouting. They believed the corridor was unguarded. And for all strategic purposes, it was, except for him. A rifle but slammed against the howitzers were behind him as Harrigan reached the gun. "Mercer, step away from the weapon. This is an order." Soldiers waded past him, some grabbing for the elevation levers, others trying to pull Elias back by the straps of his gear. Hands clamped around his shoulders. Another reached for the lanyard. Mud splashed into the air as feet skidded, boots slipping in a frantic mess of movement. But Elias didn't let go. He twisted his body, planting his weight between the officers and the firing rope. "If I stop," he gasped, "they'll break through. You don't hear it, but I do. They're right there." "We have no visual." Harrigan snapped. "No confirmation. You're acting on noise." Static exploded in Elias's earpiece at the exact moment the ground quivered beneath them, subtle but unmistakable. Not shellfire, not thunder. Treads. Heavy, synchronized treads crushing wet soil as they accelerated. Elias's eyes widened. "They're coming through the funnel now." The panic in Harrigan's expression flickered, just for a heartbeat, but it was enough. Elias tore free from the grip of the nearest soldier, lunged toward a lanyard, and wrapped the rope around his forearm. Someone shouted. Another grabbed for his elbow. Mud flew as boots slipped, but Elias had already braced himself. "This is on me," he whispered into the rain. He pulled the lanyard. The howitzer roared like a living thing. The force nearly knocked him to his knees. The officers staggered backward from the concussive blast, their shouts drowned by the thunder of the shot tearing into the mist. Silence followed, brief, fragile, suspended. Elias pressed the headphones tighter to his ears, breath trembling. The static surged with violent distortion, then a metallic crack, a detonation, screams, engines grinding in panic, the unmistakable clatter of armor colliding as the formation buckled. He exhaled so sharply it felt like an injury leaving his lungs. His head dropped forward, rainwater cascading down the rim of his helmet. Around him, the soldiers stared in stunned disbelief. Harrigan's expression shifted from rage to shock to something Elias had never seen in the man before, the flicker of doubt in his own certainty. Elias rose slowly, limbs weighted with exhaustion. "That was the corridor," he murmured. "The tanks were using it for cover. They won't now." For a moment, no one spoke. The fog carried fragments of chaos, the disarray of an armored spear that had just lost its first tooth. Elias knew they had not destroyed the entire column, but they had shattered its rhythm. And momentum in armored warfare was everything. He moved toward the radio module and knelt beside it, adjusting the dial with shaking hands. The pulse that had been so sharp moments earlier was dissolving, breaking apart like pebbles scattering down a slope. Engines were revving in different directions, some withdrawing, some trying to realign, others simply spinning in confusion. A hand clamped onto his shoulder. Harrigan's, not aggressive this time, but tense. "Corporal," the lieutenant said, forcing steadiness into his voice, "if you have any more information, anything, tell me now." Elias didn't look up. He was already scanning the pulses, isolating the fading harmonics. "They're pulling back on the funnel," he said softly. "Your scouts will confirm it soon. And if they regroup?" Harrigan asked. "They will," Elias replied. "But not on that axis. You have a window. Minutes, maybe, enough to reinforce the ridge before they try a second approach." Harrigan exhaled, stunned, calculating. The squad behind him shifted uneasily. Soldiers exchanged glances, some confused, others awestruck, none entirely understanding what they had just witnessed. A low rumble drifted across the fog again, but was different now, scattered, uneven, desperate. A retreating sound. Elias finally raised his head. His face was streaked with mud and rain, but there was a clarity in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Not triumph, not relief, responsibility. He had acted, alone, against protocol, against orders, against fear, and he had been right. But the consequences were far from over. Harrigan straightened, looking at Elias with a mixture of anger, respect, and uncertainty. "We'll discuss your actions later," he said stiffly. "For now, we move." The lieutenant rushed off to redirect squads toward the ridge, shouting new orders. Soldiers scrambled into motion, the trench line suddenly alive with urgency and coordinated purpose. The battle was shifting. Because of one shot fired by a man no one trusted. Elias sank into mud beside the howitzer, arms limp, breath shaking. His improvised module crackled softly beside him, its pulse slowing, almost calm now. But Elias knew the storm was not over. He had bought minutes. Minutes bought lives. But minutes were all he had. The fog began to thin by late afternoon, though the sky remained a lid of dull iron pressing low over the ruined fields. Rain had slowed to a mist, drifting like smoke above the churned mud. The guns along the ridge had fallen mostly silent. Only distant, irregular bursts echoed now, each one fading farther away as the German armor withdrew in disarray. The battle had not been won completely, but the breakthrough had been stopped. Not by strategy, not by orders, by seconds stolen, by a risk taken, by a single unapproved shot that no official report would describe accurately. Elias walked slowly along the ridge, helmet tucked under one arm, boots caked in fresh mud. His movements were stiff, every muscle aching from tension and exertion. He passed stretcher teams loading wounded men into jeeps, medics kneeling beside the fallen, engineers clearing paths through debris. The landscape looked as if the earth had been dragged through a grinder. Trenches collapsed, trees split, fences broken into splinters. And yet, beneath the ruin, the line still held. That alone felt surreal. From the overlook, he could see vague shapes scattered across the distant field beyond the funnel. Dark outlines of disabled tanks, some smoking faintly. They were half swallowed by fog, like beasts frozen mid-pounce. Elias stared at them with a sinking sense of scale. His shot had not destroyed them outright. It had disrupted them, thrown confusion into a formation that relied on precision. A small fracture at the right moment could crack the whole. He knew this, but seeing it was different. Seeing the consequence of his defiance stretched out across the landscape made his chest tighten. Relief mingled with guilt, pride mixed with familiar ache. Because not all the shapes in the field were tanks. Some were men, German crews caught outside their armor, Allied soldiers caught in the crossfire, lives ended in the fog where no one could see the last moments. He lowered his gaze. War didn't deal in clean heroics. It dealt in survival, measured against loss. Footsteps approached behind him. Lieutenant Harrigan stopped at his side, hands on his hips, eyes scanning the same horizon Elias had been watching. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind carried nothing but the faint hiss of cooling metal far off in the field. Finally, Harrigan exhaled. "We got word from division," he said. The armored spear pulled back. Artillery confirms they're regrouping miles east. They won't attack this sector again today. Elias nodded, though the words felt distant. They'll try another angle. They always do. Another silence, this one heavier. You understand, Harrigan continued, that what you did, there will be questions. His voice wasn't harsh now. It was weary, complicated. Unauthorized weapon use, disregarded direct orders, risking equipment and personnel. Any boy would call that insubordination. Elias nodded again. I know. Harrigan studied him with a strange uncertainty, as if reassessing a man he thought he understood. But the truth is, if you hadn't fired that shot, he paused, jaw shifting. We had been hit from the side with no defenses ready. It would have been a slaughter. Elias didn't answer. He didn't trust his own voice. I don't know what your device is, Harrigan said at last. I don't understand how you tracked them. But it worked. Elias finally looked at him. It was just noise interpretation, pattern recognition. Anyone could have. No, Harrigan cut in quietly. They couldn't. If they could, they would have. The lieutenant let out a breath that felt like resignation or surrender. I'm not putting your name in any formal complaint, he said. Not today. Another beat. But I also can't put in a commendation. You know how the chain works. Some things the brass don't want to believe unless they see it in a manual first. Elias gave a faint, tired half-smile. I know how it works. Harrigan nodded once, then walked off to another cluster of officers waiting for him. The discussion ahead would be about reinforcements, repositioning, ammunition shortages, everything except the truth. Elias remained on the ridge for a while longer, watching the fog shift across the distant field where his shell had landed. He wondered if his brother would have understood any of this, if the boy he lost so long ago would have recognized the man standing here, soaked in mud and guilt and rain, trying to prevent another kind of fire from consuming people who didn't deserve it. As the mist thinned further, the cold deepened. Elias wrapped his arms around himself and headed back toward the communications dugout. The camp was still wounded. Shouts, groans, stretcher teams moving, engines sputtering. But beneath all there was a fragile thread of surviving order. Men were alive who wouldn't have been. Positions still stood that should have fallen. Yet Elias felt no triumph. Only a strange pressure in his chest, like the aftermath of a long-held breath. Inside the dugout, the smell of wet canvas and burnt dust greeted him. His equipment sat where he left it. The improvised module rested on the wooden crate, still wrapped in the cloth he had used to shield it. Its tubes glowed faintly, pulsing with residual static. He stared at it for a long moment. This fragile, ugly piece of metal and wire that had nearly gotten him court-martialed, yet saved an entire flank of the division. With quiet hands, he unplugged the device. The glow faded. The static softened into silence. He set it gently into an empty ammunition box beside the radio, the only container he had that felt sturdy enough, secret enough. As he closed the lid, the metal latch clicked softly, sealing the module away like a relic someone wasn't ready to name. A radio transmission crackled from the main unit. HQ requesting updated field status, troop counts, weather impact. Elias responded with steady professionalism, the voice of an operator who had never stepped outside protocol. His tone was calm, controlled, unremarkable. When the call ended, he waited a moment before leaning back in the chair, closing his eyes. The rain had stopped entirely now. Only the faint hiss of distant static remained in the dugout, a soft whisper through the wires, like an echo from a battlefield, a lingering reminder of what had happened and what would be forgotten in the official retellings. He opened the box again, just enough to see the silhouette of the device inside. A twisted antenna, scavenged screws, discolored tubes, a invention no manual would ever acknowledge. He closed the lid once more. Then, lifting his gaze, Elias looked toward the open doorway of the dugout. The horizon stretched gray and endless, as if waiting to absorb the next battle, the next mistake, the next miracle. He sat there for a long time, listening, not to the static, not to the officers shouting outside, but to the quiet. The rare, delicate quiet that comes after disaster is stopped by the width of a breath. He didn't feel heroic. He didn't feel saved. He felt present, holding the weight of the moment in both hands, understanding that history would bury his name while men he never met got to live another day. Maybe that was enough. As the evening settled over the ridge, Elias stood once more, touched the top of the ammunition box containing the device, and whispered a soft, private promise to himself, a vow to carry both his guilt and his courage into whatever came next. Outside,